Imagine being a queen who ruled a kingdom, commanded armies, and negotiated treaties, and then watching your city walls crumble as Assyrian siege towers breach your defenses, knowing with absolute certainty that within hours you will be stripped of your royal garments, chained by the neck with your own daughters, and paraded through the streets of Nineveh while thousands scream insults and throw filth at you, before being forced into the Assyrian king's harem, where you will spend the rest of your life as a living trophy. A constant reminder that even queens can be reduced to property. You were told surrender might bring mercy. You were never told about the public humiliation rituals. You were never told about the forced remarriage ceremonies. You were never told that your children would be taken and raised to worship Assyrian gods. You were never told that your name would be carved into victory, monuments as a defeated possession. You were never told that death would have been kinder. In a few minutes, you will understand what happened in the throne rooms of Nineveh when defeated queens arrived in chains. In a few minutes, you will understand why Assyrian victory release showed queens crawling on their knees. In a few minutes, you will understand why Assyrian royal annals described the treatment of enemy queens with such graphic detail. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was psychological warfare designed to break the will of every kingdom watching. This is not fiction. This was imperial policy. This happened to the queens of Elam, of Babylon, of Egypt, and dozens of smaller kingdoms across 3 centuries of Assyrian domination. Ashurbanipal, writing in his royal annals around 640 BCE, described the capture of an Elamite queen with chilling precision. I brought the queen of Elam, Teman's daughter, in chains to Nineveh. I made her grind grain in my palace alongside slave women. Her royal garments I burned. Her crown I melted for gold. She who once sat on the throne now kneels at my feet. The Lachish reliefs carved into the walls of Sennacherib's palace around 700 BCE show captured royal women in explicit detail, stripped to the waist, bound by ropes around their necks, being led by Assyrian soldiers while their children cling to them. And the Rassam cylinder, discovered in 1878, contains Ashurbanipal's account of Queen Nachia Zakutu's treatment. That was so graphic Victorian translators initially refused to publish the full text. What Assyrian kings recorded as triumphs, we are about to recognize as systematic dehumanization. What their artists carved into palace walls as propaganda, we will see as evidence of institutional torture. Before we go deeper into Queen Ramaya's story, if you want more histories they buried in museum archives and sanitized translations, subscribe now and hit the bell. Because once you hear what happened to 38-year-old Queen Ramaya of Susa when Ashurbanipal's armies breached her capital in 647 BCE, you will never see ancient empires the same way again. And when you reach the moment that disturbs you most, and you will tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what shocked you the most. The year was 647 BCE. Autumn's sun burned over Susa, capital of Elam, and Queen Ramaya, standing on the palace walls, watching Assyrian siege engines batter her gates, had no idea that within 3 days she would be displayed in Ashurbanipal's throne room, wearing nothing but chains, forced to perform acts of submission that would be carved into stone and displayed for 3,000 years. Queen Ramaya had ruled Elam for 12 years alongside her husband, King Toman. She was not a decorative consort. She commanded military campaigns. She conducted diplomatic negotiations with Babylon and Media. She managed the kingdom's agricultural systems and tax collection. Ancient Near Eastern queens held real power. They were administrators, military strategists, religious authorities. Ramaya had proven herself capable in all these roles. She had 2 daughters, ages 16 and 14, both educated in statecraft and prepared for political marriages that would strengthen Elam's alliances. The siege lasted 11 days. Ashurbanipal's forces were overwhelming professional soldiers with iron weapons, siege towers that dwarfed Susa's walls, and a logistical system that could sustain campaigns for months. Toman died on the 6th day, killed by an arrow during a sortie attempt. His head was severed and sent to Ashurbanipal as proof of death. Ramaya assumed command. She negotiated for 5 more days, hoping for terms that would protect her people and her daughters. But Ashurbanipal was not interested in negotiation. He wanted total submission. He wanted symbols. He wanted queens. On the 11th day, the gates collapsed. Assyrian soldiers poured into the city with disciplined efficiency. They did not pillage randomly. They had orders. Secure the palace, capture the royal family alive, inventory the treasury. The systematic approach was terrifying in its precision. This was not chaos. This was protocol. Ramaya was found in the throne room with her daughters. She had dressed them in their finest robes, placed their royal circlets on their heads. If they were to be captured, they would be captured as royalty. An Assyrian officer entered, assessed the situation, and gestured to his soldiers. They seized Ramaya and her daughters. Without violence, no need when resistance was futile. Bronze manacles were fitted around their wrists, iron collars around their necks. And then came the first humiliation. Their royal garments were removed, not torn off in passion, but methodically unlaced and folded by soldiers who had done this before. The protocol was clear. Defeated queens must be stripped of their symbols of power before transport. Ramaya stood naked in her own throne room, while soldiers inventoried her jewelry, her crown, her ceremonial robes, her seals of office. Everything was packed for transport to Nineveh. She and her daughters were given rough wool shifts, the clothing of servants, and led outside. In the courtyard, other members of the royal household waited in similar states of reduction. Ministers who had advised kings now stood in chains. Generals who had commanded armies were bound alongside common soldiers. But the queens Ramaya and her daughters were separated, placed in their own wagon, guarded more carefully. They were special cargo, high-value prizes destined for special treatment. The journey to Nineveh took 43 days. The route was deliberate, through every major city between Susa and the Assyrian capital, maximizing visibility. At each stop, local populations were assembled to witness the procession. Assyrian heralds announced the captives' identities and crimes. The queens of Elam brought low the daughters of defeated kings, now property of Ashurbanipal. This was not transportation, it was theatre. Psychological warfare designed to convince every kingdom along the route that resistance was futile. Ramaya tried to maintain dignity. She held her head high. She comforted her daughters when they wept. But dignity is difficult to maintain when you are displayed like livestock, when people throw rotted vegetables and spit, when soldiers make crude jokes about what awaits you in Nineveh. By the time they reached Assyria, Ramaya's psychological armor had fractured. She had begun to understand that her torment was not incidental, but intentional. She was not a prisoner of war awaiting ransom. She was a trophy to be permanently displayed. The palace at Nineveh was vast, hundreds of rooms, courtyards that could hold thousands. Ramaya and her daughters were brought before Ashurbanipal in the main throne room. The king sat elevated on a platform carved with scenes of his victories. Around him stood officials, scribes, foreign ambassadors, all witnesses to what came next. This was the critical moment, the ritual of submission that would be recorded in annals and carved into palace walls. An official read the charges in Akkadian, then in Elamite, so Ramaya would understand. You are Ramaya, widow of Toman, who rebelled against Assyria's rightful dominion. You are guilty of supporting resistance. You are guilty of encouraging your husband's defiance. You are guilty of believing yourself equal to Assyrian power. Guilt was predetermined. The trial was performance. Ashurbanipal spoke. You will demonstrate your submission. A scribe stepped forward with a clay tablet listing specific acts required. Ramaya was commanded to prostrate herself. Not a simple bow, but full prostration, face to the floor, arms extended. She complied. She had no choice. Then she was commanded to crawl forward on her knees to the base of the throne, 20 feet across polished stone, while hundreds watched. She crawled. Her daughters, watching from the side, wept silently. Then came the act that would be carved into the Rassam cylinder and displayed in the British Museum 3 millennia later. She was commanded to kiss Ashurbanipal's feet while reciting a formula of submission in Akkadian, a language she barely spoke, forcing her to stumble over words that declared her people inferior, her gods powerless, her resistance foolish. But the physical submission was only preparation. The real humiliation came next. Ashurbanipal announced Ramaya's new status. She would join his harem, not as a wife, had status, legal protections, rights. As a concubine, a possession. The distinction mattered. Wives could own property, could appeal to law, could negotiate for their children. Concubines were property themselves, and captured queens became a special category of concubine displayed as proof of conquest, their royal lineage not honored but deliberately degraded. The harem at Nineveh held approximately 300 women. Royal wives occupied separate quarters with servants and privileges. Concubines lived in communal rooms, monitored by eunuchs, forbidden from leaving without permission. And among the concubines, defeated queens occupied the lowest tier, forced to serve not just the king, but anyone he designated. Ramaya was assigned to quarters she would share with two other former queens, one from a Phoenician city-state, one from a Syrian kingdom. Both had been there for years. Both had the hollow-eyed look of women who had stopped hoping. The rules were explained by the chief eunuch, a man castrated specifically to manage the harem without risk of sexual contact. Ramaya would be available to the king whenever summoned. She would perform household labor, grinding grain, weaving cloth, serving at banquets alongside slave women. She was forbidden from teaching her daughters the Elamite language or Elamite religious practices. Her daughters, courted separately, would be raised as Assyrians, eventually married to Assyrian officials to legitimize Assyria's claim over Elam. Ramaya would see them occasionally, always supervised, never alone. The goal was clear: break the connection between mother and daughters, prevent transmission of Elamite identity, ensure the next generation served Assyrian interests. What followed was not acute trauma, but chronic erasure. Days blurred into months. Ramaya ground grain with women who had once been servants in her own palace, now her equals in slavery. She served wine at banquets where Assyrian nobles drunkenly recounted the siege of Susa, exaggerating their bravery, mocking Elamite resistance. She was summoned to Ashurbanipal's chambers perhaps once a month, not frequently enough to matter, but often enough to reinforce her status. These encounters were not about desire, they were about dominance. Ashurbanipal would sometimes have scribes present, documenting that he had known the Queen of Elam, adding her to the list of conquered women recorded in royal annals. Her daughters fared differently. The younger, Ishtar-Nahiti, adapted. She learned Akkadian fluently, converted to Assyrian religious practices. At 17, she was married to an Assyrian general and produced children who knew nothing of Elam. She visited Ramaniah twice in 10 years, each visit more awkward than the last. They had nothing to discuss. The girl had become Assyrian. The mother remained Elamite, trapped in a body performing Assyrian submission. The older daughter, Melissu Mukanishat, resisted quietly. She refused to eat Assyrian bread prepared for Assyrian gods. She taught herself to write Elamite script in secret, scratching symbols into pottery shards and hiding them. At 19, she was married to a provincial governor who complained she was defiant, unsuitable. At 21, she died in childbirth. Ramaya was not permitted to attend the funeral. She learned of her daughter's death from another concubine who had overheard palace gossip. No ceremony, no burial rites, just absence. Ramaya lived in the harem for 23 years. She watched Ashurbanipal die and his son Ashur-Tilalani take power. She watched the Assyrian Empire begin its collapse as Babylon and Media rebelled. She watched younger captured queens arrive, go through the same submission rituals, join the same communal rooms. The system perpetuated itself with mechanical efficiency, and through it all, Ramaya performed her assigned role, defeated queen, living proof of Assyrian supremacy, cautionary tale carved into stone. In 624 BCE, When Babylon and Media besieged Nineveh, the harem was abandoned. The royal family fled. The eunuchs disappeared. The gates were left open. Ramariah, now 61 years old, walked out after 23 years of captivity. She had nowhere to go. Elam was a vassal state of Babylon now, ruled by strangers. Her surviving daughter was Assyrian, living in a provincial city, raising Assyrian children. Ramaiah wandered for weeks, eventually reaching a small Elamite community near Susa. They took her in, but she was a stranger to them. She spoke Elamite with an accent corrupted by decades of Akkadian. She knew nothing of what had happened in Elam during her absence. She was a ghost from a dead kingdom. She lived 3 more years. In that time she spoke to a scribe, who recorded fragments of her story, the only reason we know her name. The tablet, discovered in 1902, is housed in the Louvre. It describes her capture, her journey, her submission ritual, and ends with a single devastating line in Elamite. I am Ramaiah. I was a queen. Now I am nothing. But I remember what I was, and that remembering is the only thing they could not take. But even that small victory was incomplete, because the Assyrian records remain more prominent. The Rassam cylinder describes Ramaiah's submission in triumphant detail. The latest relief show captured queens in degrading poses. These are the primary sources that survive, displayed in museums, translated for scholars. Ramaiah's own testimony exists on a single damaged tablet, rarely exhibited, infrequently translated. Even in historical memory, Assyria won. The practice was systematic. Ashurnasirpal II did it to queens of Syria in 875 BCE. Tiglath-Pileser III did it to queens of Damascus in 732 BCE. Sennacherib did it to queens of Judah in 701 BCE. Esarhaddon did it to Egyptian queens in 671 BCE. Across 3 centuries, dozens of royal women endured the same protocol: capture, public humiliation, forced submission, harem imprisonment, cultural erasure, and all of it was documented, carved into stone, celebrated in royal annals as proof of Assyrian supremacy. Modern scholars call this symbolic violence, a sanitized term for systematic psychological torture. The goal was not just to defeat kingdoms, but to break them spiritually, to demonstrate that even queens women, who embodied divine authority in ancient Near Eastern theology, could be reduced to property. If queens could be humiliated, what hope did common people have? The message was clear: resist and watch your rulers crawl, submit and perhaps you will be spared. But Ramaiah's story contains one moment that the Assyrian annals did not record. In her 3rd year of captivity, during a banquet where she served wine to Assyrian nobles, one of them recognized her. He had been an ambassador to Elam years before, had negotiated with her when she was queen. He stared, shocked to see her reduced to this state. She met his eyes, and in that moment she smiled. Not submission, not defeat. A small, defiant smile that said, I know who I was. You know who I was. And no ritual can erase that knowledge completely. The ambassador looked away, uncomfortable. Ramaiah continued serving wine. The moment passed, but it mattered, because in a system designed to erase identity, remembering becomes resistance. And she remembered. Ramaiah's name appears in exactly 3 sources: the Rassam cylinder celebrating her defeat, a damaged Elamite tablet recording her testimony, and a fragment of a letter mentioning her death. No monuments, no tomb, no legacy beyond these fragments. But she existed, she ruled, she resisted as long as possible and endured when resistance became impossible. The systems that destroyed her are gone. Nineveh is ruins. The Assyrian Empire is dust, but the reliefs remain, displayed in museums with plaques describing submission rituals and integration of conquered peoples. Sanitized language that obscures what really happened. These were not rituals. This was torture. This was not integration. This was erasure. The queens who endured deserve more than museum plaques. They deserve to be remembered not as defeated trophies, but as people who survive systems designed to destroy them. Ramaya's story is not over. There are more testimonies buried in fragments, more voices waiting to be heard. If this moved you, tell me in the comments. If you want more stories they tried to carve into propaganda and translate into euphemism, subscribe, because their silence ends here.